So, welcome back to the channel. This is video number 2. This video will be focused mostly on Genshin Impact. In terms of what I think about the game, as I mentioned in the introductory video, this is one of the main games that I'll definitely be producing stuff for. This is the game at least right now, that I enjoy the most. It will also be about some things in terms of what the systems that exist in the game, what characters, in my opinion, are important, that kind of stuff. In terms of and where the game is now, for example, like in terms of how systems have stacked over time to the point where some characters are very important now versus not so important. Like you're always gonna have those characters. There's a decent amount of characters in the game. There's a lot of variability based on what people have access to. For example, like if you whale for the game, you're gonna have access to vastly different characters than others. It's just gonna happen. So in general, I wanted to kind of talk about the pity system and the summoning system that Genshin currently has, because in my opinion, that's where I feel like the game probably needs the most work overall. Don't get me wrong, just because the pity system is one of the places that I feel like the game needs the most work, that means like the game should not be played, just because that's where it happens to need the most work. There's a lot of things that are in the game that could be fixed, but I feel like the pity system in general is something that is definitely valuable to the players who go after those characters that they want, but they don't necessarily have a whole lot of access to. For example, there's always going to be those characters that we have and that we want that you can't necessarily go after, just because you don't necessarily have the premium currency in the game, which you can earn relatively easily, but the wishes themselves are very expensive. So to start it off, let's talk about the pity. So in terms of how Genshin works, if you've never played Genshin before, is that Genshin has a summoning system. It's a gacha game. That's what it is. If that was the one thing that you really wanted to know about the game, that is the main one. It's a gacha game. It's what it is. So you're gonna basically have to wish, as they said, wish, summon, whatever you want to call it, for certain characters. So there's basically a rarity of two different rarities of characters in the game. There's 4 stars, 5 stars. Usually the 5 stars are better than the 4 stars. That's usually how that goes. That's not always true. It is, for the most part, true. There's obviously going to be things in Genshin that are definitely going to be more advantageous to understand compared to others, but in general, the system of summoning is very important, as that will be what you have the most access to. In general, the pity system isn't horrible. It's not really the best, but it definitely has some aspects in it that I can confidently say aren't necessarily the most player friendly. So when it comes to the difference between 4 and 5 stars, 4 stars are obviously, just because of the fact that they're lower rarity, are definitely more common. For example, you're basically guaranteed a 4 star after 10 wishes. You're guaranteed a 5 star after 90, which is not very player friendly. That's hundreds of thousands of primo gems. That's the premium currency. And it takes a very long time to store up that actual amount. For example, like I know people who have played this game from what I've watched that store up premium currency for months at a time just to go after one specific character. So if you don't whale, that's basically what you're going to have to do. And whaling isn't exactly the best thing to do, especially when you're trying to save money for stuff. But in general, the pity system itself is okay, to put it mildly. In general, how they have it definitely plays into their favor versus your favor, because the more that you wish, the more likely you are to kind of get it. For example, like the 90 is basically what people call which is the guaranteed, but you can definitely get it pretty much at any time. I have gotten a 5 star, whatever you want to call it, based on luck, after like 30 something, which I think is the earliest I've ever gotten a 5 star. Between each one. The good thing about Genshin when it comes to just the pity system in general is the fact that besides the weapon banner, weapons have their own problem. In general, the pity itself stacks, kind of thing. So let's say you didn't get the 5 star on that banner, so the next banner that arrives, your pity stays the same. That is one of the best things that Genshin has, and if it was not that way, the game would be very, very, very not much enjoyable when it comes to just summoning. But in general, like, that is one of the better qualities that the system itself has when just the pity. When it comes to 5 stars specifically, if you do not get, let's say you wish and you actually do get a 5 star, but you don't get the 5 star that you want, for example, like you lose what players call the 50-50. So basically, how the 50-50 works is that if you lose it, the next time you get another 5 star, you're guaranteed to get whatever 5 stars on that banner. That in and of itself is actually very good because of how the system works. Whenever you get repeatable characters, for example, let's say you got, for example, like you got one of the characters on the 50-50 named Kaching. She's actually one of the more decent characters in Genshin right now. In general, you can basically gain a thing called constellations. So in that front, it actually makes going after certain characters a good thing. I've heard people getting the same character, regardless of 5 star, over and over and over again because they just keep losing the 50-50s after they win the next one. And in general, I can see where people get frustrated when it comes to that particular system, because that particular system advantageous is to whales, because whales are more likely to spend money on the game, because it's what they are, they're whales. In general, though, uh, the people who make the game Miyoverse are trying to find a balance of people who really nice sorry about that, are trying to find a balance of people who are willing. They're trying to find a balance of a system where it doesn't necessarily disadvantage them when it comes to money, in terms of it lowers their bottom line, so they're not really making money, but also not technically hurt the players, so where the players aren't willing to actually fork over at least a little money to go after certain characters. Like, as a business, obviously, you wouldn't want that. But overall, they've struck a decent balance over, player versus, what they want money-wise. When it comes to those particular characters that you can get from losing 50-50s on the pity-based system, some of them are decent. As I said, Kaching is actually not that bad when it comes to certain specifics. When it comes to her, she's able to deal a decent amount of energy with a few of her constellations. So if you lose, for example, the 50-50 a few times, you can get access to, those specific, you can gain access to those specific constellations, which I can show that in a few seconds. In general, I can show that for people who actually have never played what the constellation stuff looks like. In general, though, even without the pity system, if you don't even take that into account, you just talk about other factors, like the weapon banner system is absolute dog crap at the moment. It doesn't really advantage players in any way. It's more of a money system from the standpoint of, because of the fact that the weapons pity system, because weapons, as I mentioned, have their own summoning system as well, that in particular does not stack. For whatever reason, they decided, hey, let's just not make weapon banners stack. It disadvantaged a lot when it comes to that, when it comes to players, because in order to get certain weapons, for example, you have to basically wish for it and hope you get it, kind of thing. It's more or less more that, instead of just, it basically disadvantages free players and basically advantages whales completely, because whales can basically just, spend as much money as they realistically want to try to go after a certain weapon. So the weapon system at the moment is just horrible. The other part of it the other part that I can kind of see that's kind of a problem when it comes to weapons and characters in general is the fact of how the materials themselves work. For example, like, because of how the system works, like, for example, if I show you, let's say I wanted to show you Raiden, which is one of the stronger electro characters in the game. For example, I have, let's show, like, levels, for example. So, I do not have full max level. These are the XP scrolls, if that's what you want to call them, whatever you really want to call them. Just, XP materials. So, you have EXP materials. You have Ascension materials, because you have to fully do Ascension materials. So in general, you have, like, the crystals, for example, that can be a little bit of a pain to go after. These are usually dropped by bosses. For example, you have local specialties. Each major region in the game, there's 3 of those at the moment, have different sets of local specialties. These themselves can be a pain to go after, because it takes, I think, 2 to 3 days for them to, like, respawn, grow back, whatever you want to call it. And then you have common drops, which drop from enemies, like common enemies, for example, like this one, for example, drops from Ubushi, samurai people, whatever you want to call them. And in general, like, the system itself isn't horrible. It's not good, but it's not horrible. It definitely advantages whales who are willing to spend money on the game just to do it, kind of thing. Um, this is Raiden's, for example, her boss material. The problem is, when it comes to the summoning system, is that let's say you wanted to go after Raiden, but you just started the game. You don't have access to this boss material until you're basically in the end game of the game. As of right now, you don't really have access to it. So it disadvantages people who start out really new, which is why it can be a little scary to start the game, for example, like just to start that. And to make matters even worse, it's not just this stuff either. As I mentioned, weapons have their own summoning system. They also have their own leveling up system, like with the level 80 thing, and they also have to be ascended. And they themselves also have different. They have their own weapon materials, which can make the game even more grind heavy than what most people are probably looking for in a game. The good part is, usually when it comes to when it comes to Raiden and her main weapon, the Golfing Lightning, they have the same basic level up material. They use the same stuff for the most part. Obviously, the weapon material has its own. The weapons have their own material that they need, like their common material, like the Nova Shield, like with Raiden, and their own weapon level up material. Like they have their own thing. The good part is you can use other weapons that you get via summoning to level up other weapons, which is good. That would be pretty bad otherwise. The other major problem, this is the constellation thing that I mentioned earlier. Uh, when it comes to this, get a new character, basically you can use anything that you have with this. When it comes to other stuff like talents, for example, another thing that you have to level up in this game, just like basically constellations, you can review constellations to like level up certain characters. Each character has their own level up material. Like when it comes to like this, for example, like when you get to a certain level, which is 6, you start seeing this stuff, which are character level up materials. There's skill books in this game, which are this basically. Like each character has their own set of materials to use. Like it's a pain, and this game is very much grind heavy. Like a way that they could kind of sort of fix it is if they tried to, I guess, simplify things a little bit or make things more available. The major benefit to like what they have now anyway is the fact that these, for example, these scrolls here are available 3 days. All of them are always available 3 different days. For example, like you have one set that's available Monday, Tuesday, Saturday kind of thing, or Monday, Tuesday, Friday, that kind of stuff. You can see that. You have some that are available other days. All of them, regardless whether it's skill books, weapon level up materials, and no, that's it actually. If it's one of those two, like skill books and weapon level up materials, they're always available on Sundays. All of them are. It's just how you can spend your resin, which is basically the thing from earlier the thing for like domains, which is what's in front of me, for example. Like these are domains and you can spend your resin here, for example. But the problem is, at least at the moment, we have a resin cap. The problem is with that specific resin cap, for example, that the game has right now, it's not necessarily good for the players because you only have a resin cap of 160. That's in general what will need to happen is that it in and of itself needs to be extended. For example, we'll have to find some sort of system, at least in the game, where things are extended in terms of how much we're allowed to have. There doesn't really seem to be a max, but if you're not a whale and you're just a free-to-play player, for example, you're basically stuck at 160, and it takes a very long time. It takes, I think, about a day, almost a full day, for everything to to go there, to refill. So if you're not a whale, you're basically screwed once you spend it all. So how I've kind of tried to do it is make some sort of schedule for myself to try to basically, I have this set of days where I do this stuff, or this week, whatever you want to call it. It's not necessarily around anymore, but I had a schedule for a while where that was kind of how I did it. It worked for me. It may not work for you guys who play the game. That's just how I try to do things, just to try to make things a little easier for me in general. Like I said, overall the game is fine. You're always going to have in all games. You're always going to have those parts of the game that aren't necessarily what people want to see. For example, in Genshin's producers, Miyoverse have been very, I guess you could say, relatively good about listening to the players. For example, like in general, Miyoverse has done a really good job of listening to the players to try to give the players what they want. kind of thing. Like, for example, when the anniversary event happened, the rewards for the anniversary event weren't really, to put it mildly, good. They're pretty bad. But overall, they've done it. They then went around and fixed it. But overall, they've done a pretty good job of listening to players, which is very important for game producers. But when it comes to everything else in the game, they've, like, the game itself is good. However, one of the things I've kind of heard that scares people away from the game, as I mentioned, is the fact that it can get a little overwhelming with how many materials that you have to go after. For example, like, there's a lot of things you have to go after. And the problem is a lot of the characters all require different things to realistically be functionable. And that can be a really huge problem for the game in general. They are definitely working to make it a little easier for players to do their thing. But overall, like, the game definitely, as I mentioned, has its problems. But the game is doing better. It's just, at least in my opinion, it's doing better than it used to be. There used to be definitely huge problems. There still are, as I mentioned. I mentioned a few in this, actually. In general, they're doing... It's definitely going to take a while for everything to be truly good for the player versus the business side of things. The hope, for me anyway, is that they try to listen to the community a little more. They try to make things a little easier for the players, like, you know, like I said, increasing resin caps, which are very important. Just to increase those, make it a little easier for players to get the resources that they need in a relatively timely manner. And that obviously may or may not happen over time. Like, you're not going to see it overnight. That's just not what's going to happen. You know, like, you're going to see changes happen here and there, depending on, you know, when they actually truly occur. Who knows exactly how long Genshin will actually, or Miyoverse, I mean, is actually going to keep listening. Let's hope they just keep listening to us as players, and hopefully it can attract more players, because the more players we have, the more likely that they are going to be willing to listen to us as players. That's the hope, anyway. In general, when it comes, there's a few other major systems that they could fix. For example, like when it comes to artifacts, which is its own problem in general. Any player could tell you horror stories, but I'm not going to get into it in this. Then, if people really want it, I can talk. Like, artifacts literally could have their own video about what's wrong with the artifact-based system right now. Like, there is a ton of things currently wrong with it. At the moment, it could probably be argued that in and of itself, that's probably the worst system in the game right now, just because of how the system itself works. There's a lot of RNG to it, and that's what aggravates people the most. There's a lot of problems when it comes to just that. Honestly, it's a mystery how long it will take for them to actually decide to just go, like, hey, let's decide to fix it one day. Honestly, I'm hoping it's sooner than later, just to make artifact grinding a little easier, because in and of itself, artifacts are very important. For example, because they add to your stats. That's what they do. That's what makes them so important to begin with, is the fact that they do add to your stats. And obviously, your stats are very important. Everyone has their own opinion on which stats are very important. At the moment, in terms of the state of the game, as I mentioned, I was going to get to this eventually. The state of the game, definitely, in terms of what you're doing, for example, if you're doing a lot of endgame stuff, you're going to focus more on, in terms of how much damage you can output, so crit damage can be seen as very important. If you're doing a lot of boss grinding, which I tend to do a decent amount, I may actually end up doing a video on just boss grinding. I haven't decided if I actually realistically want to do that. I could do that. It's possible, but it's really going to be based on what everyone else wants. In general, when it comes to just boss grinding, like, depending on the boss you're fighting, even the bosses, for example, that you're fighting have different attack patterns, and those attack patterns are very important to know. Like, some of the, like, because of certain bosses in the game that are in the game now, like, they're really good at sucking away your energy, and because of how that works, energy recharge, in my opinion, is one of the most important stats, depending on character, for example. Obviously, every character has their own strengths and weaknesses, and you're always going to have that. But in general, energy recharge is very important because you want to have uptime on your bursts, which is what I just did right there, for example. That was Raiden's burst, and it's a pretty decent burst. But if your opponent sucks your energy away, you can't really do that. One of the better things when it comes to characters that Genshin tends to have is that it gives you a decent amount of characters for free. The starter characters in general won't get you through endgame content, for example, but they are a very good start. One of the better healers in the game is given to you for free just by completing the major Archon quest in one of the first major Archon quests in the game, which make this game very good when it comes to just Archon quests, which are the main story. And just because of that, and because of how the system itself works, they do a decent job of giving you necessarily a good early start, which is really what you need for games like this. As players, you need an early start to really enjoy the game. Like, you need a start. I've been playing this game since about a month after it came out, and like without the start that I had just via the main story, I wouldn't have really had much of a start to have. Like, if they didn't give me those characters that they gave me, there wouldn't be much to really have for it. And honestly, they did a very good job of starting. From what I understand, like, it's definitely gotten better when it comes to starting new players off. But as someone who as I said, has been playing the game for a long time, they've done a decent job of. They did a very good job of starting me off. Like, the main healer that they give you, for example, did not leave my party until I got my other healer that I have, which is Kokomi. She's probably, at least at the moment, one of the best in the game. Most healers in the game right now are Hydro, as I mentioned, which are the water element people, I mean. And a lot of them are very valuable because there aren't that many major healers in the game. There's about 2 or 3. Barbara, who's the healer that they give you, she's very decent. Her constellations, however, are iffy. A lot of people say that anyway, because a lot of them are just based on healing. So because of how her constellations work, you're not really going to gain much damage output out of them in general, but overall they're good. I would rather, if she's just going to be your healer, you would want some sort of format where she's just going to heal you, for example. That's what you want from a healer. That's what they're there for, to heal. Kokomi's damage output is really good, even for a healer, honestly. Like, obviously she has her own downsides. Like, for example, a lot of people consider, like I said, a lot of people consider crit very important, and Kokomi actually cannot crit. So a lot of people actually have considered her one of the worst of the game, just because she's unable to do that, which is very unfair to her, given, as I said, she's one of the best healers in the game. Period. Just what she is, damage output-wise. She can deal an insane amount of damage just based on her skills. And obviously, each character has its own role to fill. For example, Raiden, who I've been using her burst decently, has a decent amount of damage potential just via her skills. Her burst, for example, can deal an insane amount of damage, and it's really good. For example, Zhongli has his benefits of being a shield user. It's what he's for. He's a shield guy. And he does a very good job of that. He's probably one of the best shield people in the game. Sadly, though, currently you actually don't have access to any of these 3, because all of them are limited via limited banners, which you can actually look that up on any major source. A lot of actually YouTubers do a decent amount of source videos when it comes to videos in terms of starting off. Like, there's a decent amount of those when it comes to players who want to know exactly what's good, what's not, kind of thing. A lot of people do videos in terms of what banners are around. Miyoverse themselves actually produce a decent amount of videos for new players when it comes to informative ones in terms of what banners are available. So in general, they're doing a pretty decent job informing people, making sure everyone's up to date. You know, it's one of those things that it's a work in progress. You're always going to have that. In general and overall, this will probably be the final part of this. Overall, in terms of how I feel about the game, I know I mentioned in the video, like, that the system itself isn't, like, the game itself is good. There's obviously going to be downsides to it. I didn't even mention everything. As I mentioned, like, artifacts, like, have their own problem. They can have their own video, eventually, and how I feel about just those. Overall, Genshin has done a great job in terms of making the game very enjoyable for players. They've been making the game relatively enjoyable for veteran players like me, but they've also been doing a relatively good job of attracting new players who are kind of concerned about certain grind aspects that I mentioned. They've also been doing a decent job of making the players feel like their opinion matters. You know, we have games like that where people definitely feel like their opinion doesn't really matter that much, which can be a really big problem because as a company who's producing a game, they want to make their players feel wanted. And Miyoverse has definitely done a very good job, at least so far, making their players feel like their opinions matter. Obviously, you want your player base coming back to the game, making sure the game is, good. You're always going to have that. There's definitely, obviously, they're going to have to make improvements over time just to make sure the game itself, works. Works the way that they feel like their players work. And obviously, as I mentioned, they've been listening to the players. That's important. When it comes to how other things I feel, when it comes to like the pros of the game, I feel like one of the major pros, just besides the fact that they're listening to the players, is the fact that every character has their own role to fill. Like, you're going to have those characters that do shielding, you're going to have healers, you're going to have your main damage dealers. You're always going to have characters that do different things. And that's a really good thing that you're going to have. Like, the variety of characters in the game is very, 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 very good. Like, I could go on about just how good that in and of itself is when it comes to different roles. Like, even the main character, for example, even though most people don't really consider Traveler as the one who I'm currently controlling, is really that good. Obviously, she has her downsides as being Traveler, so she's not really made for endgame content. But her variety in just her sets and what she can do is very, very, very good. Like, she has a decent amount of just potential in her sets. Obviously, they could buff her or him, depending on which one that you choose, in terms of what they have access to. They can always buff that. Genshin storyline, for example, as one of the major things, is actually really good. Like, the storyline Genshin has definitely been working on is very good, just via Archon quests, which, as I said, are the main stuff. They're the main quests that you have access to. Overall, those in and of itself definitely make the game worth it, in my opinion. Just to see exactly where the story will definitely go from here. You're always going to have... Overall, they've done a very good job of doing things, like, for example, like when it comes to cutscenes, for example, the cutscenes in this game are amazing. I cannot say enough about just cutscenes. They've done a very good job of doing cutscenes. When it comes to other stuff, like, if anyone has like any other questions when it comes to, like, feel free to leave those in the comments. And if I really feel like I can make a video on it, I can make a video on just like what people kind of asked in terms of like how they feel about it. Feel like if I didn't explain things enough, like that kind of stuff, like I can easily make other videos about that, which will be fine for me to make. Like, honestly, I will be fine with making anything that's not necessarily the most, most confusing thing about it, because Genshin is a very complicated game. You're always going to have that, as I explained. Like, their material half of things is the worst part of it, because there's so many materials that you can use, but not all of them work in the way that you necessarily want them to, in terms of different characters needing different things. And sometimes you don't have access to those things until really late in the game, which make those characters not necessarily seem that valuable because you don't have access to those things. In and of itself, like I could make like if people wanted to see that, like I could make a kind of like a location guide for certain things, like certain materials. For example, like if you really wanted to know where certain materials are, even though Genshin does a very good job of kind of showing, relatively, like saying, like in the material, like when you click on it, for example, when you click on the character center materials, wrong page, my bad. Like when you click on, for example, let's say that you wanted to know where you needed to find, let's say you were looking for this material, as I showed earlier, like this tells you the source. Like, they do a decent job of explaining where these sources come from, and when you click on them, they will actually show you, for example, on here, they will actually show you how to navigate to stuff, which helps a lot. The main problem is that, at least in the beginning, until you get to level 30, it's not necessarily really safe to fight those guys, which you drastically need. And obviously I could go on and on about what systems really need to be tweaked in favor of the players, because the players are the most important. That will actually do it for this particular video. If anyone, like I said, if anyone has any comments, you can leave those in the comments. If you liked the video and you want to see more, like and subscribe. That is all from me.